Welcome to this short module that will just add to the relational concepts session. This is about mental mapping. I'll first remind you that when I gave this main lecture about that, I talked first about grounding of relational concepts. So for instance, if you have a phrase like red to the left of the green, and you apply that while you're seeing the scene, then the grounding of that phrase means that you have selected intentionally this red object as the target of that phrase. So we would have a neural representation in which targets locations are represented by peaks, and there will be a peak formed at the location of the red object. This phrase also requires you to intentionally select at some point the reference object. We would call the green here the reference object, and there would be another representation where that reference object is intentionally selected. We actually have run some psychophysics in our lab and published a very nice paper about that, where we have people point at the objects and we show them scenes that are more complex, that have a lot of other objects of different colors, and they get a phrase like that and have to point at that object by moving a mouse cursor onto the object. And we've been able to establish that there are some subtle interactions in which, for instance, their mouse trajectory is attracted toward locations at which the reference object for that phrase shows up. So you can imagine a complicated thing where you sometimes put it on the right, sometimes on the left. You have to make sure statistically that there's no other explanation for that than the attraction to the reference object. And we have established that is the case. So that is some kind of evidence that neurally, at some level, you are neurally creating activation at the reference location. So that can count as some form of psychophysical evidence for that. And so the architecture that did that was this complex architecture, which, however, really only used concepts that we had explained. Maybe least well explained in the lectures were these object concepts. So we had colors as concepts in the sense that neural nodes had synaptic connections to neural fields over the color dimension of different kinds, and I didn't explain that in detail in Church condition of satisfaction. So that if you activate a yellow node, it would activate a certain region of these fields, in hue space, and conversely, if you have a peak along a certain region, it can activate the corresponding nodes. These concept nodes, so they're object concepts in the sense they are about features of objects that can serve to spatially select objects. And they had also a grammatical dimension in terms of being specifications of reference or target objects. And we introduced this as, this would be a bound neural representation in the sense that there are separate neurons for representing red as a reference or red as a target. And so that is a well-known issue. It's actually not exactly role filler, but I must say this, I should change that term. But it's a form of binding the role to the object dimension that you're specifying. And the architecture actually includes some mechanism that I will explain in the next lecture about how the sequential operation occurs. I'll explain these precondition nodes here that I did explain earlier in the second lecture of today. So these conceptual nodes help to encode the relational proposition. When you say the red is to the left of the green, you put a working memory node connected to this node here into its excited state. For instance, red as a reference and some other color as a target. So setting these nodes is how you encode the output of the spatial language of the language processing system, and similarly for the spatial concepts that I'll explain in a moment. So these color nodes, color concepts can then drive visual search in the way that I explained in the lecture about high dimensional fields. So you do a visual search on such concepts. In the example, there was a second feature dimension, which is movement. So there's actually a binding across space of a movement feature and a color feature. And so that's something that you pretty much know now. The spatial concepts were, had similarly a synaptic pattern that defines them. So it defines how they're grounded, and that synaptic pattern is not just a region in Hughes space, but it's a certain region in 2D space that makes sense. So this color code here represents how strongly the synaptic connections are. And all of those spatial relations, of course, have a reference. And so the operator is centered in that reference. And to bring about that centering, you need a coordinate transform where you represent target concepts centered in a potential reference object. And so this representation going through a coordinate transform that I explained also in the high dimension lecture how that works, creates the relational field in which the operator can be applied. So the operator applied to the center of that field amounts to the operator applied in a representation that is centered on the reference object. And so there's an analogous kind of idea for rotation. If you look at movement direction and you want to center your movement direction now, not in an fixed egocentric frame, but in a frame that is centered on the moving object. For instance, the red is moving to the green and you want to say, that something is moving toward or away, then that is refers to that kind of reoriented frame. And that's an analogous coordinate transform just along one dimension that is in polar space. So it's a shift in angle, which you can do in a log polar representation. And I showed you this example of how this system figures out a spatial relationship like red to the left of green, has to select this object, which it ultimately would do here in this field. And this was a demonstration that through the condition of satisfaction, we had something that's called condition of dissatisfaction. The system was actually able to reject an initial hypothesis. The initial hypothesis is that this would be the green, but that doesn't have anything to the left. So we rejected that, built up an inhibition of return, which prevents this location from being selected again. And then ultimately it selects the correct location here and then is able to find the target. Now, what I didn't explain is how the sequence of events of these different selections emerges. And that will be the topic of the next lecture about sequence generation. So before I go there, I want to push this one level further. And that will be the level where you're not actually connected to any sensory input anymore, other than the language, the abstract taking of the language. And so that would be what you're doing when we're talking like this now, when you hear a sequence of sentences and your language processing system forms propositions out of that, might be represented at some conceptual level that no longer depend on language details, exactly how I formulated things. So that's a whole field of study, of course, how that works. I'll just assume that as a given that you can make sense of propositions, and that based on that you're mentally operating on such descriptions to then form views, make inferences about the contents of those propositions. And that would be really purely mental, purely cognitive. If you think of my original plan to say, let's say, we go from sensory motor to cognitive and higher and see how we can get, how far we can get with these perceptually grounded operations, that would be clearly a good candidate for higher cognition. So it still has to be a very specific example for us to be able to work on that. So we're using a paradigm that's been used by a whole literature. We referred specifically to work by Markus Knauff in Gießen, who studies such things with human participants. So they tell people, give people a number of propositions, ask people to really concentrate on that. Here are examples of propositions for our model like this. We use these funny colors in Hughes space. Cyan object above a green, the red object to the left of the green, the blue object to the right of the red, and so on. Actually, with colors, it's particularly demanding to keep track of the different colors. You have to really concentrate. Most of the experiments that Markus Knauff and others do use object categories that we don't have really the right infrastructure for For instance, let's say the Porsche parked to the left of the Opel, or I don't know, some other brands, or the coffee cup is to the right of the spoon, and so on. And that makes it a little easier because then these objects are easier to keep separate. But for the model, this is a good interface because we do have a direct interface with the sensory surface when we just extract the colors. That's where we use that. And so the idea is that you give participants these kind of phrases, and then you probe what perceptual or what spatial representation they derive from that by asking a question, asking to do inference. So for instance, asking whether blue is relative to the red, if that particular relationship between blue and red had not been previously given. Actually, I'm just seeing here that I do have a phrase in here, so that's actually a bad example. I have to correct that. That's actually not right. So that there will be inference. And there are some regularities in human behavior, how people do that. The major regularity out of Knauff's work is that when people build a map of these different relationships, then as they enter new objects into the map, they try to avoid perturbing previously established mappings. So for instance, when you've put an object to the right of some other object, you're not going to squeeze something in between. You're going to add it on the outside, so as to keep intact the map as you have it so far. And you will see in a moment that our model actually can reproduce that aspect. So the model for that is exactly the same in a sense. It's just a little bit simplified, doesn't have movements on it. It's a variant of what I just showed you. The only qualitative difference of this is that it doesn't have visual input here. So the scene representation isn't fed by looking at the world. It's instead connected to an internal representation, which we call the mental map. So a mental map on which spatial locations are marked, and then through associations, they are marked with contents, with color contents. And when you do inference, you actually operate on that map. And so let me so it's simplified in the sense we took away the second dimension, the movement direction, and so we have fewer operators here. And I think actually everything else is pretty much the same. So the idea here, I think I have like another amplified thing to say, this is where these instances are created, are stored. So this replaces the sensor in a sense. And the notion is that you can, once you have this map, you can actually probe this map just like you probe the visual array. That is, when you do inference, you can ask questions about spatial relationships measured on this map. And on the other hand, you enter stuff into this map by, oops, actually, it's better here in this picture. You're doing this by creating new instances here in the relational field. Now imagine that you're getting a phrase, and that phrase will activate a particular spatial operator here, like to the left of. And so in this map, the to the left is now centered on this map here to the left of. And you, from any previous items that you have entered, you get input that's coordinate transformed that would that inhibits, that you don't want to select the same location again. And then anything that remains will be transformed backwards and be entered into, or I mean, a peak form here in this, at this level will be coordinate transformed back to this level and be entered as an input to this. And if you have already in your map the object that serves as reference, then that object is selected as part of the reference operation, and this map is centered in that object. That's the case here. If you don't have that yet, you're just entering this at the default location at the center of the map. That would be your initial setting. There's actually an additional problem that we haven't solved so far, when you set up a little map like that, and then you start a description of some objects that have not yet occurred. So you like a new island, a separate little map. And there is some whole psychological aspect of that, of how people do that when they then don't know how these two groups of items might relate to each other, and can they actually put it together. We haven't gone that far, even though it is thinkable to do that. So what happens in the model is really just you seed it initially by some object that you first mentioned as a reference object, and you just put that in the center of the map. And then from then on, you're always referring to objects that are already in the map as target or as reference, and you can then generate the update. So here's an illustration of how that works. So the input to this map is a phrase. So for instance, here the phrase blue right of red, and that would be entered in these nodes. So for instance, the reference color, I guess this must be, I didn't label this, but this must be red, and I guess this here target color would be blue here, maybe comes up in a moment, and then right will be entered as a node here, and this is at a stage where the object already had, the mental map already had three objects, cyan, red, and green, based on earlier entries. I just put the labels here for us to see, but it's, of course, it's represented by, at that location, certain colors being in the scene representation. And so when you add this phrase, the red will be activated as a reference, and you see it already happened here at this stage. The red object here is activated as a reference, and it will now activate this right of red, and you will get therefore some in the red centered representation. You will, that's down here. You would enter a kernel somewhere here on the right, and that generates a new peak. But what will happen is that the green will be an inhibitory influence that pushes the location where a peak forms further out. And once that peak forms, it will be transformed back into the original coordinate frame and will be entered here as a blue object. Let's see, at the moment we'll see that. So here you see the beginning of a peak forming here on the outside. And here it reforms, and then it is entered after coordinate transform into the original map. So this is the map centered on the reference object that was selected here. And this is the original map that is centered on the object that was first introduced into this map. This entails, of course, more things. And again, I didn't explain how the sequence generation works, but it's a rough idea. So once you have that, so here's, oops, sorry. Here is the map. Here is the map. I wanted to stop this here. Here's the map at this stage where blue is also entered. And now you're asking a question of that map. So where is blue relative to green? No, there's a blue and a green in here. So the answer is, it should be to the right of, I guess. So in the spatial relationship, the to the right should come up. So here the phrase will be entered by entering the reference color and the target color, and the answer lies in this relationship. And so the answering works by bringing the target reference object from this mental map into the corresponding fields, applying the coordinate transform, and then finding the spatial operator that best matches that. And we'll see that in a moment. So the colors are brought in, the target colors is brought in, and that enables the selection of a target, and then the reference color must be coming in, and at some point the reference object comes in here. And now you see the spatial operator already lighting up. Once the centering has happened, and that will give you the answer of to the right of. So that's all I wanted to really show about that. So that is clearly higher cognition, right? That's really no longer sensory motor, although it is about a scene, the mental map is about something you can experience sensory motor. And that's why you're emphasizing here that you're using the sensory motor map to bring about, and the grounding mechanisms. And for inference, you're using that grounding mechanism. And so the larger hypothesis is that that is what you would be doing all along in cognition. So when you read a novel, our arguing would be that you're making sense of that story because you are mentally mapping things that happen, much richer, of course, with events and verbs being actions, and that's how you would make sense of a narrative. And maybe you would generate a narrative based on creating a vision like that. Now, there is another issue. Of course, this is all still sensory motor in the sense it is about space and object features and the relationship among objects. So in a sense, it's concrete stuff that you could, in principle, base on perception and action. And so an interesting topic is how that ultimately will be lifted to more abstract things that by their very nature are more abstract. So for instance, if you talk about the economy, or you talk about politics, or you talk about, I don't know, your family, the family relations, an uncle who is a bad guy or something, whatever, then it's maybe no longer so directly obvious that you're able to invoke spatial maps, for instance, or spatial relationships or movement relationships and so on to describe or to model the contents of what you're thinking or saying. And so that's something that we are very interested in. And actually, we're just considering doing a PhD thesis, maybe a master thesis on a first little step in this direction. And I don't know if Mathis Hesse is today among the listeners, is actually maybe looking into trying to do that. And that's an idea that's been around for a long time in this embodiment perspective, that you could, in principle, do that by establishing mappings between a concrete sensory motor space like that, so the visual space or some kind of allocentric space in which you have spatially meaningful operators, and more abstract spaces, so that when you talk about an abstract topic, you would essentially create some kind of metaphorical relationships. Analogy would mean that you place concepts into a virtual space that is mapped onto a concrete sensory motor space. And by reversing that mapping, you can apply sensory motor operators to your abstract map. So that's a step that is needed to ultimately fulfill that program. And people who oppose this kind of thought would argue that there is really a totally different way of making sense of concepts and talking about relations and so on. I don't know, for some reason, I got some problem here. Resume share. I hope that's, you still see me or hear me? Yeah, I don't know.
It works.
Okay, thank you. There was some glitch here in my program. I think Java wanted to do something. I had that. So that's a further research program that we are only beginning to look into. And it is not without its own tensions. There are people who, I think that is now the boundary where embodiment ends, and that then you truly have higher cognition. So this is a never-ending struggle, but we'll be looking at that next step as well. Now, the one aspect that I have not expanded on is how these sequences arise, and it's quite important in what I showed you, because this looked like it was really doing hypothesis testing and sort of really like a computer program doing things like that, just because it was sequentially doing these different things. So I need to talk about that, and that's a big issue. It's the last chapter of the dynamic thinking book, which gives a little bit of sense where you are now. So there's a lot of stuff in between that we, of course, didn't cover. But this next lecture will really give you the foundations for that. That's very critical to all that we're doing currently. So with that, I'll end this first half of lecture.